And I think we can now transition into splining. So we'll go File, Save As again, because I want to store a file without any edit, and set the version to 4 and the comment to splining. There you go. This way, even if I break something in here, I can always go back to the blocking version 3 in which everything was working just fine. It's a good time to start splining. However, before giving into the temptation of splining feet and legs and arms and whatever, we really should focus on splining the body instead. So I will hide the parts of the body that I don't need right now, and to do so I just need to go into the main group of Rocket Girl group. If you open it up, you will find the controller. If you find the transform controller and you open it up, you will find the geometry group. And if you go into the attribute editor by pressing Ctrl A on your keyboard, you can scroll down until you find the drawing overrides, these guys. Now the drawing overrides are by default enabled in Rocket Girl, but in other rigs they won't be, or they may not be rather. We just want to disable them for now, and now you see that we can click on the geometry. Earlier on we couldn't quite click on it. Now I'm just going to grab legs and arms and even the head, why not? And if you click onto the channel box tab and go down to the display layer section, you can make a new layer and store these elements in there. I will just call this thing Geo. Hidden Geo, why not? There you go. And now I will just hide it. Maybe this guy as well. Let's add it. And then finally there is the strap geo group, which we also want to add. So right click, add select. Now as I press play, there you go, I have a skeleton running. Maybe we want the teeth and the mouth and the tongue to just be hidden as well, but we certainly want to see the hips area. That's useful to us. So the problem is that the hips area is a single part with the legs, so we have to do some magic there. And if we right click on the geometry and go face, and if we right click and hold onto the geometry and go on to face, we can now select faces. And I will select one face at the very bottom of the legs, and then double click on the next one that will select an edge. I will do the same on the opposite side. And now if I hit Shift and greater than keys, you see that I can increase the selection until I get to the waist area. It's a good idea to save this selection. So let's go create, set, quick selection set. I'm going to call this thing legs, and I'm going to add it to the shelf. This way I will have a selection set down here, which I can right click on and click on select members. Or on the shelf, I have a button that selects the legs, and I can hide that stuff. That means that the geometry at the hips does not need to be on the hidden geo anymore, so I will just remove the selected object. So there you go. So now with these on, I can check the movement of the body alone, and I can finally spline it. So let's grab the up and downs first. Let's start from the very beginning, and you see they're set linear right now. So I'm going to set them to auto, and maybe I can just keep the motion a bit smoother in general, because you see that these curves are a little bit wonky there. They're a bit wobbly, so maybe we'll just grab both keys and just change them a little bit just to give me a tiny bit of motion there. As you see, I have no animated rotation on the main control, on the body control. I don't really need that. Now as I press play, the up and down seems about fine. If you're unsure on what you're doing in here, maybe one thing that you can do is create the usual sphere, which we learned to love. We're just going to match the transformation of the sphere to the one of the body controls. So select the sphere first, the body control last, modify, match transforms, all. And then we just scale the sphere up, there you go, and make it red, as we are used to by now. If you want to see the motion of the sphere, you just select the body control first, the sphere next, you go constraint parent. Now as you press play, you can check if the sphere is bouncing in any meaningful way that you like. Then we are going to check the hip instead, and we're going to, again, you see it's in linear, so auto tangents to begin with. Now let's try and make sense of those. So this curve in here is an interesting one. It's the side-to-side translation of the hip. So it kind of makes sense that the hip translates from one side to another, to be honest, but this is a bit strange. It goes one way and then it comes back immediately and then it stays flat. If I zero it out, you see the motion is minimal, so really it's not really contributing much to the motion. But one thing that I can do, maybe as I go from contact to down in here, I move this onto the leg which is holding the weight, which makes sense. This is what is going on. And instead of coming back immediately afterwards, maybe I can stay there a little bit more. So this one I don't need. And that means that on the opposite side, this key will be up here somewhere. In fact, I can grab the value that I have on the pose I am right now and then paste it there just before the other contact with the inverted value. There you go. And remember, I do not need this value. So I will have now the hip translating to the left ever so slightly, staying there. And as we approach the next contact, the hip swings to the opposite leg, which kind of makes sense. Now, if you're going to see the post-cycle and pre-cycle infinity, you see that the curve is looking a bit funky there. You see it goes down, stops, and accelerates again. You really have to make sure that for whichever curve you're working with, you make sure that the tangents create a nice and smooth transition to the next curve. And that's true for any control we have in this loop. If we grab, for instance, the rotation channels of this hip and we go post-infinity cycle and pre-infinity cycle, you see, for instance, that in here, the curve stops and starts again at the beginning of the loop. That's going to create a bit of a jitter. So we're going to just rotate the tangents to begin with so that they work nicely together. Then let's have a look at the other curves. So the X curve is moving very little, virtually nothing. So this seems to have a negligible effect. However, one of the most important rotation curves of the hips is the Y one in this particular rig. So this kind of swing is really important because it lets you, remember, extend the legs forward and backward without creating possibly excessive stretch in the leg. So we want to see what happens. So after the contact, the hip is winging backward. That's exactly what it should be doing. So we are fine in there. Maybe we can swing backward faster. So I can just delete that key and you see that the curve becomes a little bit more continuous there. There you go. And then as we approach the down, we start inverting the swing because the leg which was behind, this one, the right one in this case, starts to swing forward. So it kind of makes sense. We could maybe delay it a little bit, but it's a quick run, so maybe we can keep it that way. There you go. And then finally, this one is a bit interesting, but there is a reason for it. So in practice, as we land on the right foot, the right leg will stand straight and it will push up the hip on the right hand side of the screen at this current viewport, that is. That means that this curve does make sense. Then of course, as we move the right foot to the back, the hip will swing back down a little bit. And then as the left leg goes down towards the contact, the hip will rotate down towards the contact to enable that contact. So this all makes sense, although it looks a bit funky. So I'm not going to touch it. A sphere makes it harder, in fact, to evaluate everything we need on this. So maybe I will just elongate it as much as I can. And that should give me a better idea of the rotations. But you see it doesn't rotate at all. The reason why it doesn't rotate at all is because, remember, we constrained it to the body control, not to the hips. So now we can maybe change this constraint and we can in fact go under the sphere, delete the constraint, then go grab the sphere, the hips, and just go modify, match translation, and again match rotation. And then the hip is going to be the master, so we're going to select it first, then the sphere, then we're going to go constraint, parent, and now as we press play, you see that we can evaluate the motion. And the motion makes sense. It's nice and clean. There you go. We can have a look at the chest in there. Let's have a look at the curves. It seems about fine, but let's have a look at the curves anyway, because they are not splined at the end of the day. So we're going to auto-tangent them. The most important curve is definitely, in this case, the Y one, this kind of swing parallel to the floor. That's the most important curve, in my opinion, in a locomotion like the run. So we will expect to have a curve that is very similar to the one of the hip, but opposing its motion. And in fact, you see when the hip goes in one direction, then the chest moves in the opposite direction, which does make sense considering that the legs are opposing the swinging of the arms. Just like I simplified the curves on the hips earlier on, I can maybe delete this key and just keep the curve simple and smoother, and do the same, remember, on the opposite side. And then maybe you want to check if deleting this key makes any difference, and it does make quite some difference. I will just smoothen that curve. In Maya 2022, if you're using it, you will find out that the auto tangents will align themselves a lot better with the existing curve, so you will have to do much less of this hand tweaking of the tangents, which frankly speaking doesn't make much sense. So there you go. And in here we have the forward and backward, which we introduced earlier on. We have a bit of forward and backward motion there, but it doesn't bother me and it's hardly visible. And then we have the Z action, which we're going to see because it's a bit interesting in here, because it goes down, then it sort of plateaus, and then it moves down again. So I want to see, first of all, what's the range of motion? That is, if I zero out this key by inputting 0 in here, how much does this change the animation? And it changes a little, but enough to be noticeable. I want to delete this key and just see what happens. I think I kind of prefer if the curve is cleaner there. So we'll just have the pelvis rotate a bit more naturally and cleanly. There you go. If I wanted, in fact, I could have pushed the chest down quite a lot more on the contact, but then I should have had to counter animate, counter translate it. And in fact, if I was doing visual effects or creature animation, I would probably investigate that. But in this case, we are going for a fairly simplified run, so I'm not going to touch it. There you go, it looks quite clean, and now that we have it, we can progress with the splining. At this stage I can delete the sphere and bring back the visibility for the legs and all the other parts that I have hidden, and go on splining in the rest of the body. So I guess I can go into the graph editor and see if my best friend, the Euler filter, is doing magic. So curves, Euler filter, and you see it is indeed doing magic. You still have to check if that's what you want really, because maybe from the front view that tip is a bit too much on the inside, so maybe I can straighten it a little bit and maybe keep the leg open just until the contact. And same thing for the opposite leg. There you go, so that the contact won't only be down, but it will also be down and center if you think of it. There you go. Now I want to check the general motion, and the character is running quite okay. Let's see what happens if we make it run forever and ever, even with the rest of the limbs. So I will select all of the controls except for the master, go into the graph editor and select all curves, go curves, post infinity, cycle. I want this to loop forever and ever. Let's see it under view infinity, it's there. So now if I grab any given control, you see that the loops work just fine. Now these tangents are only in linear. I don't really need them to be linear anymore. I don't even remember when I set them to linear. I thought I only did the foot in linear. So we'll select all controls except for the feet, because the feet, at least when they translate, they have to be in linear, and convert all these tangents to auto. That should give me a nice smooth action, which indeed happens. Now if I make the timeline a lot longer, you see that the character runs forever and ever and ever and ever forward.